The Alpha King was blackmailed by a squirrel, then fell for the Omega Girl who risked everything to save him. King Roderick Vane ruled the northern packs the way most people rule a house that is slowly falling apart. He held it together with patience, long nights, and the quiet hope that nobody would notice the cracks until he had time to fix them. From the outside he looked like a king should look, tall, steady, calm in front of his court. But underneath that calm was a man who had not slept a full night in years. He had survived a coup led by his own uncle. He had survived 3 attempts on his life, one of them hidden inside a gift of wine, another hidden inside a smile from someone he had trusted. He had sat through a dinner with the Fenwick pack, who ate with their bare hands and called it an old and proud custom, and he had smiled through the whole meal because that was his job. Kings did not get to make faces at dinner. He had done all of that without losing his composure. Then a squirrel ruined his week. It happened on a plain afternoon in the war room, the kind of afternoon that should have been forgettable. Roderick was going over trade numbers with 2 of his advisors when he noticed something small sitting on the windowsill. At first he thought it was a shadow, then a bird, and only when it moved its head did he understand it was a squirrel, sitting upright, very still, watching him. That alone would not have troubled him. Northern pack territory backed onto thick forest, and animals wandered close to the castle walls all the time. What troubled him was what the squirrel was holding between its 2 front paws. His grandmother's signet ring. The ring had been missing for 3 days. It was not just a piece of jewelry. It was the key that opened the vault beneath the throne room. The vault that held old pack treaties, secret letters from long-dead kings, and a few things Roderick would rather nobody ever saw. If that ring ended up in the wrong hands, the consequences would not be small. They would be the kind of consequences that ended kingdoms. Roderick had faced grown men holding swords without blinking. He blinked now. "Leave us," he told his advisors. They exchanged a glance but did not argue. Nobody argued with the king of the northern packs when he wanted to be alone with a windowsill and a rodent. That request fell somewhere below their pay grade to question. Once the door closed, the squirrel chittered at him, one short, sharp sound, almost like a word. Then it dropped the ring, not toward him, just dropped it, letting it roll to a stop against the stone. Before Roderick could decide what to make of that, the squirrel reached into some pocket of fur that should not have existed and pulled out a small folded piece of parchment. It pushed the paper forward with its nose until it fell off the windowsill and landed near his boots. He picked it up slowly, the way a person picks up something they already suspect will ruin their day. The handwriting was neat and small. "Bring the girl from the kitchens back. The one you sent away. Do it before the next full moon, or the whole court finds out exactly how you really lost that ring." Roderick read it twice. Then he looked up at the squirrel, who looked back at him with an expression that no ordinary animal should have been able to make. It looked, unmistakably, like satisfaction. "I do not negotiate with wildlife," he said out loud, to an empty room except for one very smug squirrel. He would come to regret saying that with such confidence. He had, as a rule, made peace with difficult choices before. He had signed treaties that cost him allies. He had turned away old friends for the good of the pack. But he had never, in 11 years on the throne, had a negotiation quite like this one, conducted entirely through a windowsill and a piece of parchment that smelled faintly of acorns. 11 years was a long time to carry a crown that had never really fit right in the first place. Roderick had not been raised expecting to rule. He had 2 older brothers once, both gone now, one to a hunting accident nobody liked to talk about, the other to a sickness that swept through the northern villages the winter Roderick turned 19. He had inherited the throne the way a person inherits a house fire already halfway through the roof, forced to learn everything at once while everyone watched to see if he would fail. Some days he still felt like that same startled 19-year-old, standing in a smoking house, pretending he knew exactly which wall to save first. He had built his reputation on being careful with alliances, careful with his temper, careful with decisions that could tip a fragile peace into open conflict between packs that had been fighting each other, on and off, for generations before he was even born. Being careful had kept the northern pack standing while other territories tore themselves apart. But being careful, he was slowly beginning to understand, was not the same thing as being right, and somewhere along the way he had let the two ideas blur together until he could no longer tell them apart without help. The squirrel, infuriatingly, had just handed him that help, whether he wanted it or not. The girl. He knew immediately who the note meant, even though it had been months since he allowed himself to think her name. Wren, a kitchen omega with quiet hands and a habit of apologizing to furniture when she bumped into it, as if the table itself might hold a grudge. He remembered the particular slump of her shoulders on the day he exiled her, remembered how she had not argued, had not cried, had simply nodded and walked out of the castle gates like she had expected this all along, like disappointment was a coat she already knew how to wear. He had told himself, at the time, that it was strategy, that keeping the peace with his cousin Desmond mattered more than one kitchen girl's reputation. Desmond had a temper that flared without warning, the kind of temper that could turn small arguments into pack conflicts if it was not managed carefully. When bread went missing from the royal stores and blame needed to land somewhere, Roderick let it land on Wren instead of on the cousin who actually took it, because managing Desmond's pride felt, in that moment, like the safer political choice. He told himself that for months. He almost believed it. Now there was a squirrel with his grandmother's ring, and the truth was sitting in the war room with nowhere left to hide. He had made a bad decision and dressed it up as leadership. The squirrel, somehow, knew that, and apparently the squirrel intended to make him pay for it. He looked down at the note one more time before folding it and slipping it into his coat. "Fine," he said to the empty windowsill, though the squirrel had already vanished back into the trees the moment its job was done. "You win. For now." That night, Roderick did not sleep. He sat by the fire in his private chambers, turning the ring over in his hands, remembering the last conversation he'd had with Wren before she left. She had not begged him to reconsider. She had only asked one question, quiet and direct, the kind of question that stayed lodged in a person's chest for a long time afterward. "Do you actually believe I did it, or does it just not matter either way?" He had not answered her. He had let the silence answer for him, which was its own kind of answer, and the worst kind at that. He was a king who prided himself on being fair. Fairness was supposed to be the foundation everything else stood on, and yet here he was, remembering a moment where he had chosen convenience over fairness, and remembering it with a kind of shame that felt unfamiliar on him, like a jacket that did not fit right. The next morning he called for his best tracker and asked, without much explanation, to be taken south, toward the villages that bordered the free lands. He told his court it was a matter of trade inspection. He told himself it was a matter of damage control. Both of those were true, in the way that convenient stories are often technically true while missing the actual point. It took 3 days of travel to find her. Word moved slowly in the villages outside pack territory, and even slower when the person you were looking for did not want to be found by anyone connected to the crown that had thrown her out. Eventually, though, a blacksmith in a border village mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a quiet Omega girl had been working the forge 2 towns over for the better part of a year. Odd, the blacksmith said, because Omegas didn't usually work forges. Too much heat, too much danger, not the kind of work most packs allowed their Omegas to do. But this one, he said, worked like she had something to prove, or something to outrun. Roderick found the forge at the edge of a village that did not appear on any map he owned. The heat hit him before he even stepped through the open doorway, and the sound of hammer against metal was steady, almost meditative, like a heartbeat made of iron. She was exactly as he remembered, and also nothing like he remembered. Her hair was longer now, tied back and singed short at the ends from the sparks. Her forearms carried new scars, small burns healed into pale lines against her skin. She looked stronger. She looked tired in a different way than she had at the castle. A tired that came from carrying her own weight instead of carrying other people's decisions. She noticed him before he said a word. Of course she did. A king does not walk into a small forge without the room noticing. "Your Majesty," she said, and the words came out sharp enough to cut, nothing like the soft apologies she used to offer to chairs and door frames. "I need you to come back," he said, because he had rehearsed a dozen better opening lines on the ride down, and every single one of them evaporated the moment he saw her face. "Do you?" Her tone made it clear this was not a question she expected him to answer honestly. "There's a squirrel," he said, which was, admittedly, not the explanation he had planned to lead with. She set down her hammer slowly, like she needed the extra seconds to decide whether she had heard him correctly. Then she looked at him the way you look at someone you're fairly sure has lost his mind, possibly out here in the heat, possibly a long time before that. He explained it as best he could: the missing ring, the note, the blackmail. As he spoke, he watched something shift behind her eyes, something that was not quite surprise. "Describe the squirrel," she said. "Small, reddish fur, holds itself upright like it's used to being looked at, writes better than half my court." Ren closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, there was no surprise left at all, only the particular exhaustion of someone confronting a very old, very familiar problem. "That's my brother," she said. Roderick had prepared himself for many possible answers walking into that forge. He had not prepared himself for that one. "Your brother is a squirrel. My brother got cursed 6 years ago because we couldn't pay a toll to a witch who takes offense easily. And yes, Your Majesty, my brother is currently a squirrel, and apparently my brother is also apparently now committing crimes against the crown on my behalf, which is frankly exactly like him." There was a story behind that sentence, an old and painful one, and Roderick could tell from the tightness in her jaw that she was not planning to hand it over easily, not to him, not after everything. So he did not ask for more. He simply nodded, the way you nod at something too heavy to pick up all at once, and let it sit between them. "Will you come back?" he asked again, softer this time. She studied him for a long moment, arms crossed, forge heat still radiating off the walls around them. "Not for you," she finally said, "for the job, and because apparently my brother is going to keep committing petty larceny against a king until I do, and I'd rather he stop before he gets himself skinned for a hat." It was not forgiveness. It was not close to forgiveness. But it was a door left open just wide enough for Roderick to walk through, and he intended to. The ride back to the castle was quiet, in a way that felt loud. Ren did not make conversation, and Roderick, who was used to filling silence with diplomacy, found that he did not know how to fill this particular silence at all. Every attempt at small talk felt like it would land wrong, so mostly he let the miles pass without words, watching her out of the corner of his eye, noticing the careful, guarded way she held herself, like someone bracing for a blow she'd already learned to expect. They stopped for the night at a small inn along the border road, the kind of place that asked no questions as long as coin changed hands. Roderick took a room across the hall from hers, more out of habit than thought, and it was only when he sat down at the small wooden table inside that he realized he hadn't eaten since morning. He found her downstairs a while later, sitting alone near the fire with a bowl of stew she wasn't really eating, just stirring slowly, watching the flames. "You don't have to sit with me," she said, without looking up, before he'd even said anything. "I know," he said, and sat down anyway. They ate in silence for a while, the fire cracking softly between them, other travelers murmuring at nearby tables. It was Ren, eventually, who broke the quiet, her voice low enough that it stayed between the two of them. "When I left the castle, I told myself I wasn't going to think about any of it again. Not the kitchens, not the court, not you. It was easier that way. Easier to just be someone new in a place that didn't know my name yet." "Did it work?" Roderick asked. "Being someone new?" She considered the question longer than he expected. "For a while. Then my brother started leaving little gifts on my windowsill, feathers, shiny buttons, once an entire dead beetle he seemed very proud of, and I'd remember that I still had exactly one person left in the world who knew who I really was, curse or no curse. After that it got harder to pretend I'd actually started over. You don't really get to start over when someone still remembers your whole story." Roderick thought about that for a long moment, turning his spoon slowly in his bowl. "I don't think I want you to have started over," he admitted, selfishly. "I think I'd rather you still remembered all of it. Even the parts that don't put me in a good light. Especially those parts," Ren said, with the faintest, driest hint of a smile. "Or how would I know when you're lying to me now?" "Fair," he said, and for the first time since the forge, something between them eased, just slightly, like a rope let out a little more slack. They reached the castle gates as the sun was dropping low, painting the stone towers a deep orange that almost made the place look gentle. Almost. The kitchens welcomed Wren back with more warmth than Roderick expected, several of the older staff hugging her tightly, one woman crying openly and calling her "our girl" in a voice thick with relief. It was clear, watching that reunion, that Wren's exile had not only cost her something, it had cost the kitchens something too, a steadiness they had missed and never quite replaced. Roderick stood back and watched, feeling, for perhaps the first time in years, genuinely unnecessary in his own castle. That should have been the end of the immediate crisis. The girl was home, the blackmail should have stopped, and Roderick could go back to pretending his biggest problem was trade tariffs with the Fenwick pack. It was not the end of anything. Word of Wren's return reached Desmond within the hour, because word always reached Desmond within the hour, one of the many small and infuriating talents that came with being a man who paid too many people to whisper in his ear. Desmond arrived at the war room that evening uninvited, his expression carrying the particular calm that Roderick had learned, over many years, to read as danger. "You brought the thief back," Desmond said, not quite a question. "She was never a thief," Roderick replied. "You know that better than anyone." Desmond did not flinch, which told Roderick everything he needed to know about how little guilt his cousin carried over the whole affair. "The court believed she was. That was enough to keep the peace. The court believed what I told them to believe. That's not the same as the truth." "No," Desmond agreed easily, "but it's usually more useful." There was a version of this conversation Roderick had rehearsed in his head 100 times over the years, a version where he finally said everything he actually thought about his cousin's temper, his cousin's carelessness with other people's lives, his cousin's habit of treating consequences like something that only happened to lesser men. He did not say any of it now. There was too much at stake, too many pack alliances that ran through Desmond's family line, too many reasons a king had to swallow his own anger for the sake of stability. Instead, he said simply, "She stays. That is not something I am negotiating." Desmond's jaw tightened, just slightly, before his expression smoothed back into practiced ease. "As you wish, cousin. I only hope you remember who actually keeps this pack loyal to you when the girl causes trouble." He left without waiting for a response, and Roderick stood alone in the war room for a long while afterward, feeling the particular weariness that came from winning an argument and still somehow feeling like he had lost. Over the following weeks, life at the castle settled into something that almost resembled normal. Wren returned to her place in the kitchens, though returned was too simple a word for what actually happened. She worked harder than before, faster, more precise, as though speed and precision were armor against anyone who might try to accuse her of anything ever again. She barely spoke to Roderick outside of necessary formalities, and when their paths did cross in the halls, she offered exactly the correct amount of respect required, and nothing more. The other kitchen staff noticed, of course, the way people always notice small changes in someone they care about. An older cook named Hetty, who had known Wren since she was a child too small to reach the counters, took to leaving the easier tasks for her on the mornings she looked especially tired, never commenting on it directly, simply making the work a little lighter without being asked. It was a small kindness, the kind that didn't announce itself, but Roderick noticed it too, noticed how much of Wren's resilience had actually been quietly propped up by people around her who cared, without needing credit for it. It made him wonder, uncomfortably, how much of his own steadiness as king had depended on people like that, people he had perhaps not thanked nearly often enough. He found himself, against every instinct of good sense, looking for reasons to walk past the kitchens. The squirrel visited twice more that month, though its visits grew stranger each time. Once, it left a small carved wooden bird on Roderick's windowsill, no note attached, no explanation given. Another time, it simply sat there for almost an hour, watching him work through paperwork, occasionally making small disapproving noises whenever he sighed too loudly over trade documents, as if even the squirrel had opinions about how tediously Roderick ran his kingdom. Roderick began, without quite meaning to, talking to the squirrel the way some people talk to themselves while working, thinking out loud over half-finished letters and unresolved trade disputes, half expecting no response and getting none, until one evening the squirrel knocked a particular scroll off his desk, again and again, until Roderick finally picked it up and reread it properly, only to realize it contained the exact clause he'd been searching for all along. After that, he stopped assuming the animal was simply keeping him company, and started, cautiously, treating it like it understood a great deal more than anyone gave it credit for. "You could just be a person again," Roderick told it one evening, half joking, half genuinely hoping the animal might understand him. "Whatever this curse is, I have resources, scholars, people who study these things." The squirrel tilted its head, considered him for a long moment, then hopped away without a backward glance, leaving Roderick with the distinct impression that he had somehow offended a rodent. He mentioned it to Wren the next day, cautiously, the way you test the temperature of water before stepping in. "He doesn't trust easily," she said, not looking up from the bread she was shaping. 6 years of being small and unheard does that to a person, even when the person offering help happens to be a king, especially when the person offering help happens to be a king who exiled his sister, Roderick said quietly. Wren's hands paused, just for a second, over the dough. "Especially that," she agreed. It was the first honest exchange they'd had since her return, and though it was small, though it solved nothing, it felt like the beginning of something Roderick did not yet have a name for. He began asking, gently and without pressure, about her brother. Not all at once, not in a way that demanded she hand over her whole history in a single conversation, but in small pieces over many weeks, the way you coax a wounded animal closer with patience instead of force. Slowly, the pieces came together. Their parents had died when Wren was young, leaving her and her brother, whose human name was Corwin, to survive on their own in a border village that did not extend much charity to orphaned children. When a traveling witch demanded payment for crossing a bridge on their land, and the children could not pay, the witch, in a fit of impatience rather than true cruelty, cursed Corwin instead of simply turning them away. Small and reddish and unable to speak, he had spent 6 years trying, in whatever limited ways a squirrel could manage, to help his sister survive a world that was not kind to Omegas without family or money. "He blackmailed a king to get my job back," Wren said one evening, sitting on an overturned crate near the kitchen door, while Roderick leaned against the frame, neither of them quite willing to call this a conversation they were choosing to have, though they both clearly were. "That's who he is. He'd blackmail anyone if he thought it would help me. Curse or no curse, that part of him never changed." "He's the only family you have left," Roderick said. It was not a question. Wren's jaw tightened, the smallest fraction, gone again almost as fast as it appeared. "He's the only family that still recognizes me as family." That's not quite the same sentence, but it's close enough. Roderick thought about all the family he had left as king, distant cousins who wanted his throne, advisors who wanted his favor, a pack that wanted stability more than it wanted him specifically. It occurred to him, sitting there in the fading evening light, that he might understand her sentence better than she realized. "I want to help break the curse," he said, "properly, not because I owe your brother anything, though I clearly do, but because nobody should have to spend 6 years, small and unheard, just because 2 children couldn't pay a toll." Wren looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for whatever insincerity she still half expected to find there. She did not find it, and something in her posture eased, just slightly, like a held breath finally let go. "Careful, Your Majesty," she said. "Keep talking like that and people might start thinking you're a decent person." "Wouldn't want that," he said. "Ruins my reputation." It was the closest thing to a joke either of them had managed since her return, and it landed exactly the way it needed to. Roderick put his scholars to work immediately, sending letters to every pack library within riding distance, asking about curse-breaking, about witches who dealt in toll magic, about any precedent for reversing a spell cast in anger rather than true malice. Most of the responses were unhelpful. A few were outright discouraging, warning that curses cast by offended witches often required the exact offending party to reverse them, and that finding a specific witch, 6 years and countless miles removed from a random bridge crossing, was closer to impossible than difficult. Roderick refused to accept that as a final answer. He had spent his whole reign solving problems other people called impossible. This one, he decided, mattered more than most of them combined. While the search for the witch continued, life at the castle grew more complicated in other ways. Desmond's resentment did not fade with time, the way Roderick had hoped it might. If anything, it sharpened, curdling into something quieter and more calculated. Roderick began noticing small things, court gossip that seemed to originate suspiciously close to his cousin's inner circle, whispers questioning whether an Omega with a criminal history, however fabricated, should really be trusted so close to the royal kitchens. A visiting pack leader who mentioned, with false casualness, hearing rumors about the king's growing personal interest in kitchen staff, rumors that could only have come from someone deliberately spreading them. Wren noticed too, though she said little about it, absorbing the whispers with the same quiet steadiness she absorbed everything else, filing each slight away without letting it show on her face. It was Tomlin, one of Roderick's oldest and most trusted guards, who eventually brought the more serious concern directly to the king. "There's talk," Tomlin said carefully, standing at attention though his tone carried none of the usual military stiffness. "Talk that Lord Desmond has been meeting with representatives from the Ashcombe pack. Talk about renegotiating certain succession agreements, should anything happen to weaken confidence in your leadership." Roderick absorbed that slowly, feeling the familiar cold weight of political danger settle over him, a weight he had not felt this heavily in years. "He's building a case against me, using Wren as the excuse." "It would appear so, Your Majesty." Roderick thanked Tomlin for the warning and spent that entire night awake again, not turning a ring over in his hands this time, but turning over every possible move his cousin might make, every angle Desmond might exploit. He had survived a coup once already. He had no intention of losing everything now, not when things were finally, cautiously, beginning to feel like they might work out. He considered, briefly, the easier path. He could quietly ask Wren to step back from public visibility for a while, keep her work confined to the kitchens, away from court gatherings, away from anything Desmond could point to as evidence of impropriety. It would cost her nothing she hadn't already survived once before: a smaller life, a quieter role, safety bought through invisibility. It would also, he realized almost as soon as he thought it, be exactly the same mistake he had already made once, choosing convenience over what was actually right, just wearing a gentler disguise this time. He decided, somewhere in the small hours of that sleepless night, that he was done making that particular mistake twice. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived faster and more publicly than Roderick expected. It happened during a formal gathering of pack representatives, the kind of event where every word carried weight and every gesture was watched by a dozen interested parties. Leaders from the Fenwick pack sat near leaders from 3 smaller allied territories, all of them there to discuss trade routes and border patrols, none of them expecting the evening to turn into anything more dramatic than tedious negotiation over grain tariffs. Desmond, in front of the assembled leaders, raised the subject of certain irregularities within the royal household, citing Wren by name, questioning her reinstatement, suggesting, in carefully diplomatic language that nonetheless carried an unmistakable accusation, that the king's judgment might be compromised. "It concerns me," Desmond said smoothly, addressing the room rather than Roderick directly, a technique Roderick recognized immediately as a way of building an audience rather than simply making an argument, that decisions affecting the security of this castle, and by extension, the security of every pack allied with it, might be influenced by matters of personal affection rather than sound judgment. "I raise this not to embarrass my cousin, but out of genuine concern for the stability we have all worked so hard to maintain." Roderick felt the room's attention shift toward him, felt the particular pressure of a public moment that could either be handled or could unravel everything. Before he could respond, Before he could even fully organize the words he intended to use, Wren stepped forward from where she had been standing, near the kitchen staff along the edge of the hall, still in her work clothes, flour dust still faintly visible on her sleeves. The room went silent, in the specific way rooms go silent when someone does something nobody expected. "If Lord Desmond wants to discuss irregularities," Wren said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, steady in a way that made it clear she had decided, somewhere in the last several seconds, that she was done being quiet. "Perhaps we should discuss who actually took the bread from the royal stores a year ago, and why the king chose, at the time, to protect a cousin's pride over a kitchen girl's reputation." A ripple moved through the assembled leaders, murmurs rising and falling like wind through trees. "I am not proud of that decision," Roderick said, finding his voice and stepping forward beside her, refusing to let her stand alone in front of that much scrutiny. "It was a mistake, one I have been trying to correct since the day I made it. If loyalty to this crown requires punishing an innocent person to protect a guilty one, then loyalty built on that foundation was never worth having in the first place." Desmond's expression cracked, just slightly, the calm mask slipping to reveal something colder underneath. "You would risk pack unity for a kitchen girl." "I would risk pack unity for the truth," Roderick said. "Unity built on lies is not unity. It's just a lie that hasn't collapsed yet." The gathered leaders exchanged glances, and Roderick could feel the moment balancing on a knife's edge, could feel that the next few seconds would decide far more than just this particular argument. It was, unexpectedly, one of the visiting pack elders who broke the silence, an older woman from a smaller northern pack known for valuing honesty above almost everything else. "A king who admits his mistakes in front of his own court," she said slowly, "is rarer and more trustworthy than one who hides behind them. I, for one, find that reassuring rather than concerning." Murmurs of agreement followed, quiet but unmistakable, and Roderick watched Desmond's carefully built case crumble in real time, watched the room's sympathy shift in a direction his cousin had clearly not planned for. Another leader, from one of the smaller allied territories, added his own voice to the growing agreement, pointing out that his own pack had suffered under leadership too proud to admit fault, and that pride dressed up as strength had cost them more, over the years, than honesty ever could have. By the time a third leader spoke, echoing much the same sentiment, it was clear the room's mood had turned decisively, and Desmond's earlier confidence had nowhere left to stand. Desmond did not concede gracefully. He left the gathering early, his expression carved from stone, and Roderick understood, with the particular clarity that comes after a public confrontation, that this was not truly over. Men like Desmond did not simply accept defeat, they regrouped. But for that evening at least, the immediate danger had passed, and Roderick found himself standing beside Wren in the emptying hall, both of them slightly breathless from adrenaline neither had fully processed yet. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. "But I was tired of being talked about instead of talked to. Seemed like a good time to change that. That took more courage than most of my advisors manage in a year. I've had practice being brave about things that terrify me," she said, and something in the way she said it made it clear she was not only talking about tonight, was perhaps talking about 6 years of a missing brother and an unfair exile and a lifetime of learning to survive without much help from anyone. "You get good at it eventually, doesn't make it easier, just makes it familiar." Roderick thought about the sweet, dangerous relief of anger, how it had steadied him more than once in moments, exactly like this one, a tool he reached for instead of feeling the fear underneath it. He wondered if Wren's courage worked the same way, a shield built over something more fragile. He did not ask. Some things people needed to offer on their own timeline, not have pried out of them in a hallway after a confrontation. The weeks that followed brought a strange, uneasy calm. Desmond retreated from open conflict, though Roderick knew better than to mistake retreat for surrender. Wren, meanwhile, found herself treated differently by the court, no longer whispered about with suspicion, but regarded, cautiously, with something closer to respect. It was not comfortable for her, this sudden visibility, but she carried it the way she carried everything else, with quiet, stubborn steadiness. Between the two of them, something continued to grow, slow and careful, built more on small moments than grand gestures. Roderick began finding excuses to walk through the kitchens in the evenings, ostensibly checking on supply reports, actually just wanting to see her methodical hands working dough, wanting to hear her dry, understated observations about court life that made him laugh more genuinely than anything his advisors managed. Wren, for her part, began leaving small things at his study door, an extra portion of the bread she knew he liked, a note correcting some minor error in his understanding of curse-breaking folklore she'd overheard him discussing. Neither of them named what was happening between them. Both of them noticed it anyway. The true crisis, when it arrived, came from a direction neither of them expected. The scholars Roderick had commissioned finally traced a lead on the witch responsible for Corwin's curse. A reclusive woman living deep in a forest 3 days' ride from the castle, known locally for a temperament that shifted without warning between generous and dangerous. Roderick decided to go himself, unwilling to send anyone else to negotiate on his behalf for something this personal, and Wren insisted on coming, refusing every argument he offered about safety and unpredictability. "He's my brother," she said, in a tone that ended the discussion before it properly started. "I am not waiting at a castle while other people decide his fate for him. Not again." They rode out together, along with Tomlin and a small, discreet escort, the squirrel himself trailing somewhere in the trees above them for most of the journey, occasionally darting down to sit on Wren's shoulder for a while, before disappearing back into the canopy. The witch's home, when they found it, was less a cottage and more a living structure, grown from an enormous old tree, roots forming doorways, branches forming windows. The witch herself, when she emerged, was younger than Roderick expected, sharp-eyed, clearly unimpressed by titles. The last stretch of the journey had been the hardest, the forest growing thicker and quieter with every mile, the kind of quiet that made even seasoned guards like Tomlin keep one hand resting near his blade without seeming to notice he was doing it. Wren had grown quiet too, though hers was a different kind of silence, tight and focused, the silence of someone rehearsing words they were terrified they might not get the chance to say. Roderick had ridden close beside her for the last hour, saying nothing, simply present, the way she had once been present for him in a garden full of weeds. "A king," the witch said, looking Roderick over with open skepticism, "come to lecture me about mercy, I assume." "Come to ask for it," Roderick corrected, "not for myself, for a boy who couldn't pay a toll 6 years ago and has been paying for it every day since." The witch's gaze shifted to the squirrel now perched on Wren's shoulder, something unreadable moving across her expression. "The bridge toll incident. I remember it. I was having a difficult season. Difficult seasons make for poor decisions. Then you understand poor decisions have consequences that outlast the mood that caused them," Roderick said. "I made one myself, not long ago. I understand exactly how long that kind of shadow can follow a person." The witch studied him for a long moment, then studied Wren, whose expression carried none of Roderick's careful diplomacy, only raw, unguarded hope that she wasn't bothering to hide anymore. "You could simply refuse us," Wren said, before the witch could speak again, her voice unsteady but determined. "I know that. I've spent 6 years imagining every way this conversation could go wrong, and refusal was always near the top of the list. So I'm not going to waste your time pretending I have some clever argument that will change your mind if kindness alone doesn't. I'm just going to ask, plainly, because plain and honest is all I have left to offer you." "Please," Wren said simply. "He's all I have left. Please." Something in the plainness of that request seemed to land harder than any of Roderick's careful arguments. The witch's sharp expression softened, just slightly, into something closer to weariness than power. "Curses cast in anger are easier to break than curses cast with true intent," she said. "This one was always going to lift eventually, on its own terms, when the anger behind it had properly faded. I simply never checked back to see if that time had come." She crouched down, extending one hand toward the squirrel, who, after a long, hesitant moment, climbed cautiously into her palm. "Let's see, little one. Has enough time passed to let go of what I was feeling that day?" The light that followed was quiet, rather than dramatic, a soft golden shimmer that wrapped around the small animal in her palm and slowly, gently unfolded him back into something larger, something human, until a young man knelt on the forest floor where a squirrel had been a moment before, breathing hard, staring at his own hands like he had forgotten what fingers were supposed to look like. Wren was on her knees beside him before anyone else could move, and the sound she made, half laugh, half sob, was not something Roderick had words for, not something he tried to interrupt. Corwin's first words, once he found his voice again after 6 years of silence, were rough and unpracticed but unmistakably, warmly familiar. "Took you long enough," he said to his sister, and she laughed and cried at the same time, and held on to him like she was making sure he was real. Roderick stood back and let them have that moment, feeling, once again, entirely and happily unnecessary. The ride back to the castle was nothing like the ride out. Corwin, adjusting slowly to having a human voice again, talked almost constantly, filling 6 years of silence with observations, terrible jokes, and an alarming number of opinions about acorns that he claimed, with complete sincerity, he could not fully unlearn. Wren laughed more in those 3 days than Roderick had seen in the entire time he had known her, and watching her laugh, easy and unguarded, he understood with sudden clarity exactly how much he wanted more of it, wanted to be someone who got to witness that lightness regularly instead of glimpsing it in small, rare moments. He did not say any of that out loud yet. There would be time for that conversation, he told himself. First, there was still Desmond to deal with, still a kingdom that needed steadying. That steadying came sooner than expected, and easier than Roderick had feared. With Corwin restored and able to speak for himself, the full truth of the bread incident finally came out in a way nobody could dismiss as rumor or convenient story. Corwin, it turned out, had witnessed the entire original incident from his hidden vantage point as a squirrel, had seen exactly who took the bread and exactly why blame had landed on his sister instead. His testimony, delivered calmly and directly in front of the same assembled pack leaders who had witnessed Desmond's earlier accusations, left no room for doubt. Desmond, faced with undeniable proof rather than deniable rumor, did not have the political ground left to stand on. He left court quietly not long after, taking a minor position in a distant allied pack. His ambitions for the northern throne effectively ended, though Roderick made sure, quietly and without cruelty, that his cousin was not left with nothing. Some mistakes deserved consequences, few deserved ruin. With the immediate crisis resolved, the castle settled into a calm Roderick had not felt in years, maybe ever. Corwin took quickly to castle life, eventually finding purpose training as a scout, claiming, with a grin, that 6 years of squirrel instincts made him uniquely qualified for the job. Wren remained in the kitchens, though her role expanded naturally over time as the staff, and eventually the court, came to recognize her steady competence for what it actually was. It was several months later, on an ordinary evening that felt like 100 other evenings they had shared by then, that Roderick finally found the words he had been circling around for a long time. He found her in the kitchen gardens again, kneeling in dirt that technically wasn't hers, pulling weeds nobody had asked her to pull, the same as the very first evening he'd truly talked to her after bringing her home. "You could have told me you forgave me a while ago," he said, sitting down beside her without asking, ruining another coat in the process and not particularly minding. "Forgiveness isn't really a single moment," she said, not looking up, hands still moving through the soil. "It's more like weeding. You do it a little at a time, and you're never quite finished, and every now and then something you thought you'd already pulled up grows back anyway. That's either very wise or very concerning. Can be both," she said, finally glancing over at him, something warm and unguarded in her expression that he had rarely seen directed his way before. "Most true things are." He picked up a weed she had pulled and turned it over in his hands, the same small habit he'd fallen into months ago whenever he wanted to say something and didn't quite know how to start. "I want you to stay," he said, "not because of your brother, not because of politics, just because I want you here, and I think, if I'm honest, I have wanted that for longer than I let myself admit." Wren sat back on her heels, studying him with the particular careful attention of someone who had been let down before and had learned, painfully, not to accept pretty words without checking them against actions first. "I don't do this twice," she said quietly, "getting close to people, trusting a place, only to lose it all over again. I don't have twice left in me." "Then I'm not asking you to have twice in you," he said. "I'm asking for once. Just this once, done properly, done honestly, for as long as you're willing to let it last." The corner of her mouth moved, small and reluctant and entirely genuine. "That's not exactly a declaration, Your Majesty." "No," he agreed, setting the weed down carefully, like it mattered, because in its own small way, it did. "It's a start." And somewhere above them, perched in the branches beyond the garden wall, a young man who used to be a squirrel watched the king of the northern pack sit in the dirt beside his sister, unbothered by his ruined coat, in no hurry to leave. Corwin smiled to himself, satisfied, the way only someone who once solved an impossible problem with nothing but sharp teeth, stubborn loyalty, and a stolen ring could be satisfied. The job, as far as he was concerned, was finally, properly done. A year passed, the way years tend to pass once the worst of the trouble has finally settled, quickly in memory and slowly in the living of it. The northern packs found a steadiness under Roderick's rule that the court had not felt in a long while, the kind of steadiness that came not from avoiding hard truths, but from a king who had learned, the difficult way, that honesty cost less in the long run than convenient lies ever did. Trade improved along the southern border. The Fenwick pack, of all unlikely allies, sent a formal letter praising the crown's fairness, which Roderick kept folded in his desk drawer for months, more out of disbelief than sentiment. Wren's role in the castle grew slowly and naturally, the way real trust usually grows, without ceremony, without anyone declaring it out loud until it had already become obviously true. She still worked the kitchens most mornings, still shaped bread with the same careful, practiced hands, though these days she was as likely to be found beside Roderick in the war room in the afternoons, offering opinions on trade decisions that affected ordinary villagers in ways his advisors sometimes forgot to consider. She had a way of asking simple questions that cut straight through complicated arguments, a skill Roderick had come to rely on more than he ever admitted to his court. Corwin, for his part, settled into castle life with the enthusiasm of someone who had spent 6 years unable to properly participate in anything and now intended to make up for lost time all at once. He trained as a scout under Tomlin's patient supervision, proved unnervingly good at finding hidden paths through the forest, and never quite lost his habit of collecting shiny, useless objects, though now he did it as a joke rather than a survival instinct, leaving small, ridiculous trinkets on Roderick's windowsill purely to see if the king still flinched at the memory. There were harder nights, too, ones Corwin didn't talk about much and Wren never pushed him to explain, nights where he woke suddenly and sat very still for a long time, as though checking, out of old habit, whether it was safe to move. Wren usually found him before anyone else did on those nights, sitting quietly beside him without demanding conversation, offering only her presence and, occasionally, a slice of the good bread saved specifically for moments like that. Roderick watched this from a respectful distance, learning, slowly, that some wounds needed patience rather than solutions, that not every problem in a person's life was his to fix simply because he happened to be king. He still flinched every time Corwin left something new on his windowsill, and Corwin still laughed about it every time, and somehow that small, silly ritual became one of the steadiest threads holding the whole strange, patched-together family together. Desmond, from his distant post in the Allied pack, sent one letter that winter, brief and formal, congratulating Roderick on the season's harvest reports. It was not an apology, it was not quite reconciliation, but it was something, a small door left unlocked instead of fully open, and Roderick chose to read it as a beginning rather than an ending, the same way he had once chosen to read Wren's guarded return as a beginning rather than a debt repaid. On the evening of the first snowfall that year, the castle held a small gathering, nothing as grand as the formal court events Roderick usually endured. Just kitchen staff and guards, and a handful of close advisors gathered around the great hall's fire, sharing food and easy conversation, while snow gathered quietly against the windows outside. Wren sat beside Roderick on a low bench near the hearth, her shoulder against his, not performing anything for the court, not managing anyone's expectations, simply present in a way that had taken both of them a long, careful year to earn. "You know," she said, watching the fire, "when my brother first climbed through your window with that ring, I don't think either of us imagined it would end anywhere close to this." "I certainly didn't," Roderick admitted. "I imagined scandal, possibly a very embarrassing ballad written about the king who got blackmailed by wildlife." "There might still be one of those," Wren said. "I've heard rumors." "Wonderful." She laughed, quiet and genuine, and leaned her head against his shoulder, and outside the window, barely visible in the last gray light before full dark, a familiar reddish shape sat perched on the sill, watching them both with what could only be described, even now, even restored to two legs most of the time, as deep and thorough satisfaction. Some debts, Roderick had come to understand, were never really about the ring at all. They were about a boy who loved his sister enough to risk everything he had, even as a creature with no voice and no power, just to make sure she was never alone again. And some kings, if they were lucky enough and humble enough to learn from their own worst mistakes, eventually became the kind of men worth that kind of risk. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and steady, settling over the castle like something patient finally allowed to rest.